This video is another edition in a series of videos where I look at a certain section of the DC universe and go over the live-action debuts of each character to determine who took the longest and who took the least amount of time to jump from the comics into live-action. Following my videos about the Justice League and the Teen Titans, this video is about their predecessor, the original comic book superhero team, the JSA. This video will include old members of the JSA as well as other Earth 2 teams. Just because the JSA haven't had all that strong of a live-action presence, I'm including the other associated teams like Infinity Inc., All-Star Squadron, which is basically just an expanded JSA, as well as the Seven Soldiers of Victory, with the exception of characters who are more prominent members of other teams, like Superman, Batman, Green Arrow, and Speedy. In addition, I'll be including villains who are strictly enemies of the JSA, and at that point, after all that, I decided what the hell, let's include every Golden Age character in this video, as they won't realistically be able to appear anywhere else. So basically, yeah, the video title is a bit of a lie. It's not a JSA video per se. It's a video going over the history of live-action debuts of Golden Age characters who remained Golden Age characters, so let's begin. Our first live-action debut comes from all the way back in the year 1947, so kind of still the golden age of comics, with a character named Greg Sanders, aka Vigilante, who's included because he's a member of the Seven Soldiers of Victory. The next Vigilante, the Adrian Chase version, will not be in this video. Apparently, Vigilante had a serial back in the year 1947. I did not know that. It's called The Vigilante, Fighting Hero of the West. Vigilante debuted 6 years prior, so that's a pretty short gap right off the bat. After him is actually in the same serial his sidekick Danny Long, aka Stuff, who has a 5-year gap, although I have never heard of him prior to this, so he won't go on to have a very important career. Another serial that came out around this time is Blackhawk Fearless Champion of Freedom, coming out in 1952. These characters were never members of the JSA, and at the time were not even DC characters, they were Quality Comics characters. However, like I said, I wanted to include other Golden Age heroes in this video, and that's mainly because of this serial that I found out about that I wanted to talk about that I couldn't really talk about anywhere else. So this serial saw the live-action debuts of the leader Blackhawk, whose name is Blackhawk. He has an 11-year gap, alongside Andre, Stanislaus, Hans Hendrickson, and Olaf, who all have an 11-year gap, plus Chop Chop, who also has an 11-year gap, but he debuts in a different issue, as well as Charles Wilson, who has just a 10-year gap. Next up is Wonder Woman. She debuted in a TV pilot known as Wonder Woman Who's Afraid of Diana Prince, which is like a 5-minute TV pilot that never went anywhere, but it is technically her live-action debut with a 25-year gap. You might be wondering why I'm including her but not Superman or Batman, and that's just because Wonder Woman has always had a more prominent role on the JSA compared to those two, even though Superman and Batman were definitely members of the JSA originally. And yeah, she's a more prominent member of the Justice League, but she's still a prominent member of the JSA, even recently, unlike Superman and Batman. Similarly, Hawkman was also in the Justice League video, but there's no denying that he's a very prominent member of both teams. Hawkman debuted in Legends of the Superheroes, now in the year 1979, with a 39-year gap. Alongside him, there's Black Canary, who again was also in the Justice League video. However, I mentioned in that video that it's not really clear which Black Canary she's supposed to be based off of, whether that be the mother Dinah Drake or the daughter Dinah Lance. The former is more of a JSA character, while the latter is more of a Justice League character, so if it's based off of the Dinah Drake version, she has a 32-year gap. And if she's based off of the Dinah Lance version of the character, then the gap is irrelevant, but the situation is because then Dinah Drake wouldn't have debuted in live action until Birds of Prey in 2002, which also, by the way, stars Helena Wayne, who debuted here as well in Legends of the Superheroes with just a 2-year gap. And finally, for Legends of the Superheroes is Solomon Grundy, the first JSA villain to debut in live action with a 35-year gap, and he's also the final character for the 20th century, as we now jump all the way to the year 2007, and the TV show Smallville, which will accompany a large portion of this video, as it basically accompanies a large portion of every video. Smallville Season 7 saw the live-action debut of Vandal Savage, who's a JSA villain and a Justice League villain and a villain of basically the entirety of the DC universe, but originally he was a villain of Alan Scott Green Lantern and Jay Garrick Flash and other members of the JSA, plus the JSA themselves. He has a 64-year gap. And that brings us to a big one. Smallville Season 9, Episode 11, titled Absolute Justice Part 1, saw the live-action debuts of 10 members of the JSA, as well as 2 JSA villains. Most of these appearances are just cameos, however, the cameos that have actors attached to them, which is a lot of them, are counted as these characters' live-action debuts, even if they go on to have larger roles elsewhere, as they have actors, so they do count as their debuts. So going from largest gap to smallest, we start with Wesley Dodds, aka the Sandman, who did only appear in a cameo and to this day has yet to appear anywhere else, with a 71-year gap. Then there's Ma Hunkel, aka the Red Tornado, that being the original one with no association to the android, who also only appeared in a cameo and to this day has yet to appear anywhere else other than being referenced in Black Adam, and she has a 71-year gap as well. Al Pratt, aka the Atom, also only ever appeared in a cameo on Smallville and then another, slightly bigger cameo in Black Adam, and he has a 70-year gap, as does Kent Nelson, aka Dr. Fate, who didn't just appear in a cameo. He had a fairly large role in this episode of Smallville, and he has a 70-year gap. Jay Garrick, aka The Flash, also debuted here with a 70-year gap, however, he would go on to appear elsewhere in The Flash starting in Season 2 in the year 2015. So if you don't want to count this as a live-action debut, there is another live-action debut to consider. Alan Scott, aka the Green Lantern, also cameoed here, and to this day has yet to appear anywhere else, and he also has a 70-year gap. Then there's Sylvester Pemberton, aka the Star-Spangled Kid, with a 69-year gap, and while this is just a cameo, it's a slightly larger cameo than others, but he would go on to have a larger role on Stargirl. Terry Sloan, aka the original Mr. Terrific, debuted here in a cameo. He has yet to appear anywhere else, and he has a 68-year gap, as does Ted Grant, aka Wildcat. He would go on to have a larger role in another show, specifically on Arrow, starting in Season 3, or more specifically in Season 3, as well as on Stargirl later on. He also, like I said, has a 68-year gap. Then there's Courtney Whitmore, aka Stargirl, who didn't just appear in a cameo. She had a fairly large role in actual lines, and she has an 11-year gap. The villain of this episode is actually Cameron McKent, aka Icicle, who has a 23-year gap. He is a JSA villain. Plus, his father also cameoed here. His name is Jorma Kent, aka Icicle, and he has a 63-year gap. However, while this is a cameo, he would go on to have an actual role in live action as the main villain of Stargirl in Season 1 and beyond. A follow-up episode in Season 10 would show the live-action debut of Hawkgirl with a 70-year gap. However, she doesn't actually become Hawkgirl, or at least we never see it, and we would see it in the 2015 Arrowverse crossover Heroes Joined Forces for the first time. With Smallville now over, that brings us to the next section of this video, that being all about the Arrowverse, starting with Jim Corrigan, aka The Spectre, debuting in Constantine Season 1 with a 74-year gap. We never actually see him as the Spectre, aside from like a flash forward or a vision of the future, where we see Jim Corrigan covered in green energy, but we never actually see him as the Spectre, and to this day we still haven't. The only character we've ever seen as the Spectre is actually Oliver Queen, although that's definitely not the same character. The second episode of The Flash used a villain named Kyle Nimbus, aka the Misc, who in the comics is actually the arch enemy of Starman. Now, none of the Starmen have ever appeared in live action. The only one to ever appear was never actually Starman in the comics, that being Sylvester Pemberton, but his arch enemy, the Misc, has, and he has a 73-year gap. In the first episode of Season 2 of The Flash, Al Rothstein, aka Nuklon, but then later rebranded to the more popular name Atom Smasher, made his live-action debut with a 32-year gap, but it wasn't a very good live-action debut. He was used as a one-off villain with awful CGI. Still though, it is technically his live-action debut, and he's the same character. A couple episodes later, Jessie Quick made her live-action debut with a few changes. Instead of being the daughter of Liberty Bell and Johnny Quick, and her name is Jessie Chambers, her name is now Jessie Wells, and she's the daughter of Harrison Wells. Those other two speedsters who are her parents in the comics have never appeared in live action, but Jessie Quick has a 23-year gap. Hopping on over to Arrow Season 4, we have Mr. Terrific making his live-action debut, and also with a name change, as in the comics his name is Michael Holt, while on Arrow, for some reason they changed his name to Curtis Holt, which has yet to be explained, and obviously never will. He has an 18-year gap. Alongside him, Baron Blitzkrieg, an enemy of the JSA, or the All-Star Squadron at the very least, appeared as the flashback villain of Arrow Season 4. He has a 38-year gap. Another enemy of the All-Star Squadron is Deathbolt, who also debuted in Arrow Season 4, and he has a 32-year gap. 2015 ended with the Arrowverse crossover Heroes Join Forces, which is all about Hawkman, Hawkgirl, and Vandal Savage and their intertwining origin stories. Vandal Savage was changed drastically from being a 50,000-year-old caveman to being like a 2,000-year-old Egyptian, and basically he was changed into the character Hoth Set, who was the primary antagonist in Hawkman and Hawkgirl's origin story. He has a 75-year gap. A pretty prominent JSA villain, Perdegaton, made his live-action debut in Legends of Tomorrow Season 1 with a 69-year gap. However, he only ever really appeared as a kid and hasn't appeared anywhere since. In the season finale of Legends of Tomorrow Season 1, there was a cliffhanger that set up Season 2, which saw the live-action debut of Rex Tyler, aka Hourman, as he introduced himself as a member of the Justice Society of America. He has a 76-year gap, and we'll get to the actual JSA of the Arrowverse in just a minute, but there are two characters in between. There's the All-Star Squadron member Jim Harper, aka Guardian, debuting in Supergirl Season 1 with a 74-year gap, as well as Black Siren, who debuted in The Flash Season 2 with just a gap of 14 years. This is because she debuted for the first time in the Justice League episode Legends, which saw an alternate universe very similar to Earth 2, which was originally supposed to be about the JSA, but then was changed for some rights reasons to the Justice Guild of America, and Black Canary was changed to Black Siren, so technically Black Siren is kind of a Justice Society character, so I'm including her in this video. She's the only member of that team to actually appear in live action anywhere. That brings us to Legends of Tomorrow Season 2 and the actual JSA of the Arrowverse. We have Charles McNider, aka Dr. Midnight, with a 75-year gap, Todd Rice, aka Obsidian, with a 33-year gap, Hank Haywood, aka Commander Steel, who wasn't a JSA member, but he is an All-Star Squadron member, with a 38-year gap, as well as his grandson, Nate Haywood, aka Citizen Steel, with just a 9-year gap. The episode also had a villain known as Baron Krieger, aka Captain Nazi, who debuted in the comics 75 years prior. Then we have a couple of villains in a row from The Flash. We start in The Flash Season 3 with the character known as Shade, who originally was a Jay Garrick villain, but he also is definitely a JSA villain, and he appeared for the first time in The Flash Season 3 with a 74-year gap, although he's never actually named Richard Swift, and an actual Richard Swift, aka Shade, would appear later on Stargirl in the year 2020. Then there's Clifford DeVoe, aka The Thinker, debuting for the first time in The Flash Season 4 Episode 1, with a gap of 74 years as well. In the very next episode, The Flash Season 4 Episode 2, Becky Sharp, aka Hazard, who is an All-Star Squadron villain, as well as the granddaughter of the JSA villain, The Gambler, made her live-action debut with a gap of 30 years. The younger daughter of Black Lightning, known as Jennifer Pierce, aka Lightning, actually became a member of the JSA for some reason in the late 2000s, and she debuted for the first time in Black Lightning Season 1 with a gap of 10 years. Back in The Flash Season 4, another Jay Garrick and JSA villain, Isaac Bowen, aka The Fiddler, made his live-action debut, kind of. His first ever live-action appearance was as a gender-bent character. Instead of Isaac Bowen, his name is Izzy Bowen, and he wouldn't actually later appear as the character Isaac Bowen until Stargirl in the year 2020. Roger Hayden, aka the Psycho Pirate, debuted in the Elseworlds Arrowverse crossover with a 53-year gap, and in the next crossover, Crisis on Infinite Earths, John Sargent, aka Sargon the Sorcerer, who in the comics was a very little-known hero, and here he appeared as a very little-known villain, had a 79-year gap. Crisis on Infinite Earths then ended with a montage of the new multiverse, including our first ever look at Stargirl and that world, and we basically got the live action debuts of the entirety of Stargirl's team in this scene, aside from Stargirl herself, as this is her third live action appearance. There's Stripe, also known as Pat Dugan, with a 79-year gap. I guess you could say that since there's no actor involved, this isn't Pat Dugan's live action debut, and he wouldn't debut until Stargirl Season 1, Episode 1. The gap doesn't change since that's also in 2020. Rick Tyler, aka Our Man, with a 35-year gap. Also with a 35-year gap is Yolanda Montez, aka Wildcat, as well as Beth Chappell, aka Dr. Midnight, who also has a 35-year gap. All three of these characters debuted in the same year. That brings us to Stargirl, which gives us a lot to cover, so let's begin with Larry Kroc, aka Sportsmaster, who has a 73-year gap, as well as his wife Paula Brooks, or Paula Kroc, aka Tigress, who also has a gap of 73 years, and their daughter Artemis Kroc, who has a gap of 33 years. Then there's also Henry King Sr., aka Brainwave, with a 77-year gap, as well as his son Henry King Jr., aka Brainwave Jr., who debuted 40 years later, so he has a gap of 37 years. The aforementioned The Gambler has a 76-year gap, The Wizard has a 73-year gap, and The Dragon King has a gap of 39 years, as he was actually only introduced as an enemy of the All-Star Squadron. Then also his daughter Shiv, who was introduced as an enemy of Stargirl, has a gap of 21 years. Still in the very first episode, Justin, aka Shining Light, or rather Sir Justin, also made his live action debut. He's a member of the Seven Soldiers of Victory, and he has a gap of 79 years. All of that was from the very first episode of Stargirl, but also Season 1 wouldn't give us any more live action debuts, unless you count Crimson Avenger and The Wing Hao, both of whom only ever appeared in a picture, but it seems like they took the picture with actual actors, and since they haven't appeared anywhere since, and while it has only been 3 years, I can't see them appearing anywhere at all in the future. I think this is technically their only live action appearance, and probably will be for a very long time. Any actual future appearance in live action, if they ever get one, will negate this one, but for now they have a gap of 82 years, meaning that if they appear anytime soon for real, they could have like one of the largest records ever, as they are very, very old characters. Season 2 also gave us a lot of introductions, including Bruce Gordon, aka Eclipso, who ended up being the main villain with a gap of 58 years, Jennifer Lynn Hayden, aka Jade, who has a gap of 38 years, and basically has the largest ever role for a Green Lantern in live action, aside from Hal Jordan, and she's not technically a Green Lantern. Then there's Johnny Thunder and the Thunderbolt, who both have a gap of 81 years, which is pretty crazy. There's also Jakeem Williams, aka Jakeem Thunder, who's Johnny Thunder's successor, who has a gap of 25 years. And to end off Stargirl Season 2 is Director Bones, who has a gap of 31 years, which actually brings us to The Sandman Season 1, which saw the live-action debut of two JSA-related characters, Hector Hall, who in the comics has been known as the Silver Scarab, Sandman, and Dr. Fate, appeared for the first time in The Sandman Season 1 as none of those things with a 39-year gap, alongside his wife Lyta Trevor, or Lyta Hall, aka Fury, who also doesn't appear as a hero, and she also has a gap of 39 years. Then Black Adam came out, which saw the live-action debut of the DCEU's Justice Society of America, but only one of its 4 members hadn't already appeared in live-action somewhere, that being Maxine Hunkel, aka Cyclone, who's a fairly new character, especially for a member of the JSA, and despite debuting for the first time in 2022, she has a 15-year gap. And returning to Stargirl, we have Stargirl Season 3, which only introduced 2 characters who hadn't already appeared elsewhere. There's the Ultra Humanite, who was originally a Superman villain, but over the years has actually become more of a JSA villain, and he has a staggering 83-year gap, which was the biggest in the Superman video, and well, it's gonna be the biggest in this video as well. Then there's also King Standish, who honestly, I don't know who this character is, but he appeared on Stargirl, and he's super old. He has an 82-year gap as well. And that is it for all of the characters, but that brings us to the next sections, the top 5 list, and as usual we'll start with the shortest. In 5th place is a tie between Charles Wilson, the member of the Blackhawks, as well as Jennifer Pierce aka Lightning with 10 years. In 4th place is Citizen Steel with 9 years, in 3rd place is Vigilante with 6 years, in 2nd place is his sidekick Stuff with 5 years, and finally at number 1 is Helena Wayne aka The Huntress at just 2 years. As for the top 5 longest, we start in 5th place with Brainwave at 77 years, in 4th place is Sargon the Sorcerer, Stripe, and Shining Knight, all 3 of whom have a 79-year gap. In 2nd place is Johnny Thunder and the Thunderbolt with 81 years, in 2nd place is King Standish, but also kind of Crimson Avenger and Wing Hao, all of whom have an 82-year gap, but again, for the other 2 it's kind of. And finally, in 1st place is the Ultra Humanite, who has a gap of 83 years.